at Arlington, and welcome to our panel entitled Miscellaneous Mining. We'll hear three wonderful papers on an assortment of topics about the broader mining world. Before we begin, do note that, as always, we'll have a Q&A after the talks, and we do have a fairly large block of time here, so there should be plenty of time for discussion and stuff at the end as we go through. So anyways, I'm going to introduce our speakers as we move through the program. We're going to go in order of what's on the program. And so our first presenter here today is Dr. Terry Reynolds, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Michigan Tech University and is a past president of the Society for the History of Technology. He's published many essays and books on the history of the Lake Superior Iron District, including Iron Will, Cleveland Cliffs, and the Mining of Iron Ore, 1847 to 2006, and the Metal of a Thousand Uses, Mercury Mining in Arkansas, 1930 to 1946. The title of Dr. Reynolds' talk today is From Notoriety to Obscurity, Antimony Mining in Arkansas, 1873 to 1947.
In April 1874, a Memphis paper, repeated by a Little Rock paper, declared that there was no doubt that Arkansas is richer in minerals than any other state in the Union. Something that may come as a surprise to those of you in the western states. But what prompted this outburst of state pride was the recent discovery of antimony, or rather stibnite, the ore from which antimony is extracted in southwest Arkansas. And should any of you wish to see a real live sample of stibnite, my wife has charge of it there to make sure none of you steal it. Now, what is antimony? Now, Mark Hendrickson has told you about it the last two meetings, but I asked him, he said, yeah, you better repeat it to him. This is a very slow crowd. It takes repeating things 3 times for anything to sink in with it. So, a brief primer on antimony. There it is. As Mark has told you before, it's almost never used alone. It's too hard, it's too brittle. But it is frequently used as an alloy material. Chart there indicates some of the uses along with the percentage of antimony that goes into it, all the way from type metal, which can be as much as 30% antimony, down to your common ordinary bullet that sometimes you like to shoot people with that has only 1 to 2% antimony in it to harden the lid. Now I tried to find what the most frequent use of antimony was in the late 19th century. I failed. The best I could do was this chart here dating from 1917, 1918, when the primary use of antimony was in making anti-friction metals, alloys with copper and tin, what's often called bad metal. You can see in this one that shrapnel and bullets are number 3 on the list. Largely because this is in the middle of World War I. Lead for battery plates. Farther down, it would increase later. Today, the primary use of antimony is in fire retardants, but that didn't come until World War II. Antimony was discovered in Arkansas somewhere in the fall of 1873 by Robert Wolfe. There's a good chance that old Bob Wolfe didn't recognize what he had. This is in the backwoods of Arkansas. And it's likely that he either thought in these surface outcrops of quartz, where he found this other mineral, that he had either silver and some stibnite. The mineral looks sort of like silver. Or he thought it was argentiferous lead, silver-bearing galena. In any case, apparently, that attracted the interest of a couple of Joplin lead entrepreneurs, Muffet and Sargent. They were interested in the possibility of there being argentiferous lead in southwest Arkansas, because there was at least one mine where there was some, and it had supplied the Confederacy during the Civil War. And Moffett and Sargent apparently had folks down in South Arkansas, and they went to take a look at old Bob Wolf's mine. And in January of 1874, they sent a number of specimens of argentiferous lead from southwest Arkansas to Charles P. Williams at the Missouri School of Mines for him to assay it. And Williams wrote back to Moffett and Sargent, "No, one of these samples you sent me isn't galena at all. It's stibnite. Where the heck did you guys find this?" And they apparently got back to him and said, "Well, we found it in southwest Arkansas, in Sevier County." Now, there is an antimony belt there that runs about 11 miles long by somewhere around 2.5 miles wide. The news seeped out within a few months. In April of 1874, this appears in a wide number of newspapers. Joplin Mining Company that Moffett and Sargent were involved with is going to erect a couple of smelters at the most extensive antimony lodes ever discovered in the world. Now, how anybody in South Arkansas had any idea of antimony beds anywhere else, God only knows. The largest ones at the time were probably in Borneo, but maybe the culprits in South Arkansas were a lot smarter back then than they are now. In any case, this little piece here appears all over the country, slightly modified in some cases, from San Francisco to New York, Chicago, New Orleans. It's all over the place. And it brings in enough prospectors and entrepreneurs that within a few months, a second mine is discovered called Antimony Bluff, and about 3 years later, a third one, the Stewart mine. Now, why did all this attract enough attention to be in papers all over the country? Well, first, it was believed, though how anyone came to believe it is not certain, but that these were the largest antimony mines in the U.S., if not the world. Not only that, and this other one has a little more validity to it, it was the only significant deposit of antimony to be found east of the Rockies. And as you can see there, the then known possible antimony deposits in the west were a lot farther than the nation's industrial heartland than were these Arkansas deposits, which theoretically should have some advantage on the market. And these Arkansas deposits had the potential to significantly reduce American reliance on foreign ores. You can see the average amount of antimony imported in the U.S. in the early 1870s was around 600 tons. There was no native production. There had been a couple of short-lived attempts in California to start up an antimony smelter and to mine antimony. Those were very short-lived and then failed. Phelps Dodge, just beginning to get in the mineral business, sent one of their people down to southwest Arkansas to take a look at the Antimony Bluff mine, which was up for sale. And by this time, this is 1877, some Arkansas antimony has been smelted and has reached the market, commands a premium over British ores. We know of 5 tons that made it to market as early as October 1874. There's other scattered references to shipping out 7 tons of ore, 30 tons of ore, but nobody was keeping records back then, so we don't know how much went out. But Phelps Dodge thought there was a possibility. They send someone down, and he says, you know, I think out of the Antimony Bluff mine, we can get about 300 tons a year. In other words, enough to cut America's reliance on largely British antimony, almost in half. And he says, I think we can make a profit. It might not be much of a profit, but I think we can make a profit. But before doing this, we might want to check out those western deposits a little more closely. So there was good reason to be excited about these antimony deposits, good reason for them to gain a good deal of notoriety. But there were problems that help explain why Phelps Dodge decided ultimately not to do it. Problem number one, transportation. It is 65 miles from the antimony mines to the nearest river port and train station. 65 miles overland on improved roads. The last 10 miles are very up and down since it's the foothills of the Ouachita Mountains. And of course, once you get to Fulton, which is the nearest railhead, and the head of navigation on the Red River, you then got to get it elsewhere. And what makes this even more problematic is what it was going to take to get it to market. Well, you get it to Fulton and you got two choices. You send it to Little Rock by rail and then steamboat to New Orleans, or you put it on a boat on the Red River and go directly to New Orleans. Then it has to be transported to London, where it will be smelted, and then brought back into the U.S. In other words, from the time you mine it to the time somebody in New York buys it to alloy type metal or battle metal, that stuff has traveled 10,000 miles. Now, if that weren't enough of a problem, you got the problem of nobody in the hell knew how to smelt antimony in the U.S. Remember Muffin Sergeant? They were going to immediately erect smelters. Well, they couldn't find anybody that knew how to design them. And they gave up. A few years later, about 1878, they did find somebody, another company, to build a smelter. The guy had about 1 or 2 years of metallurgical experience. He had worked a year at a gold and silver mill in California, and he came to Arkansas and tried to build one. And as you can see from the bottom quote, it failed. Okay, so you don't know how to build smelters. You got to transport stuff 10,000 miles. Then there's the fact that a lot of folks that came into the area weren't really interested in antimony. They knew antimony was often associated with silver, and they thought if they dug down far enough on the antimony vein that it was going to turn it into silver ore at some point. And when it didn't, they said to heck with it. And then there was a third problem. This is southwest Arkansas. Average rainfall 50 inches. Water table is high. And a number of the early attempts hit the water table, and because they had to haul in all sorts of equipment 65 miles after unloading it at the rail depot, it's small-scale engines that couldn't handle the water. And if that wasn't enough problem, none of these early companies had enough capital. What we need most in Arkansas is capital and brains. Capital to have enough money to put in big steam pumps and improve the transportation system, enough brains to know how to smelt antimony. And I might mention smelting antimony is a tough proposition. It's why in Europe it was sort of closely kept to the existing smelters. They didn't let out how they did it. It takes very careful temperature control. So Arkansas's first attempt to make an impact on the American antimony market fails. And the bar is going up. By the 1880s, we're importing about 1,200 tons of antimony annually, not 600. 1,200, about twice as much. In other words, one Arkansas antimony mine is unlikely to make much of a difference. It's likely to take the entire field. Now, people in the state of Arkansas and officials were nonetheless convinced that they had a winner here and that they needed to do something about it. So what they did, this is the great age of expositions, is there's the Arkansas Pavilion at the Centennial in Philadelphia. One of the things that they bring is samples of stibnite to show the fine quality ore just waiting Eastern capital and brains in order to bring it to fruition. And at the Southern Exposition, Great Southern Exposition in 1884, the Arkansas State Exhibit won the grand prize, best exhibit in the whole thing. And one of the reasons cited for giving the award to Arkansas was the fine quality of its exhibit of antimony and antimony ores. Now, all of this may have had some influence because in early 1883, an Eastern syndicate quietly begins buying up properties in the Arkansas antimony district. They call themselves the United States Antimony Company. They even went so far as to build a town just across the county line in Howard County, just north of the antimony district. One of the reasons they may have decided to begin looking at this is the transportation situation had improved. Now, instead of having to haul the stuff 65 miles to Fulton, they have had to only haul it 30 miles to Nashville, Arkansas. And then they could be on the extension of the Iron Mountain Road. Not only that, the Eastern Syndicate pushed so hard that by 1887, 3 different rail lines had surveyed routes through their little plotted town of Antimony City. So it looks like the transportation system issue is about to be resolved. The capital issue looked like it was about to be resolved. These are people who had money. They included several coal magnates. It's largely Philadelphia, little New York money. There are several coal magnates, major banker, an ex-governor of Pennsylvania. It was money. I mean, $5 million capitalized when they finally incorporated. Now, to put this in context, the average capital in an Arkansas firm in 1890 was $7,000. The national average was $18,000, and you got a firm here that it's capitalized at $5 million, and at least according to one source, all the stock was sold. And we know they invested at least $150,000 in the district. Oh, and the fact that they call themselves the United States Antimony Company suggests that they got out of their head that they got to get down to silver. They're looking for antimony. And with that capital, they began to bring in high-quality steam pumps, even though they got to haul them 30 miles overland to get them to the mines. So it looks like by the late 1880s, all those problems that I talked to you about from the 1870s are about to be solved. You know, insufficient capital, we got it now, $5 million. Inappropriate mindset, we're doing antimony, U.S. Antimony Company, not silver. Water issues, these big steam pumps, we now have the money to bring in. For transportation, well, it's improved, and looks like a total solution might be in sight with one of these 3 railroads that are promising to go to Antimony City coming in. The metallurgical expertise, maybe. They're talking about bringing in a European to try to solve the metallurgical problem. So, U.S. Antimony Company buys up a lot of the early properties in the rectangle you see there, and they go exploring for new properties. They found May mine on the eastern end of the district, and the Otto mine on the western end of the district. And all their efforts began to get publicity. There's even an article in an Australian paper about Arkansas antimony. And there's good reason for it to get notoriety again. First place, in the late 1880s, this was the only antimony mining company in the U.S. that probably has ever paid dividends to this point. In 1887, 88, they seem to have been paying 6% dividends on the mines. And it was the only antimony mine in the country at the time being worked at all. What also was impressive about this attempt was they planned complete vertical integration. That is, they were going to mine the antimony, then at the site they were going to mill it and smelt it, and then adjacent to the smelters, they were going to build factories to produce those goods that relied on antimony, starting with paint. Antimony was used to produce a superior white paint that had better coverage than any other type of white paint, and then they were going to go to Babbitt Metals, pipe metal factory, etc. So they planned complete vertical integration and were even offering inducements to other manufacturers to relocate in the area. Then they were going to experiment with a different method of concentrating antimony than the existing standard method. More about that later. And it did present, at this point, a rare example of even an attempt at an antimony smelter in the U.S. And of course, for the state of Arkansas, it looked even better. Well, you got one of the largest the largest probably capitalized company in the state, maybe a railroad was bigger. It was considered the best organized industrial plant in Arkansas. It had the deepest mines, and was the most extensive mining operation in the state. And on top of that, it was the only electrified mine in the state. But all of this, particularly the ambitious plan for vertical integration, depended on improved ore concentration, building a successful smelter, and the transportation system actually being solved. Well, let's start out with the attempt to concentrate ore. Traditional way to concentrate antimony was to melt the stibnite from the surrounding waste rock. Problem is with that, it wasted 10 to 12% of the antimony went straight up the stack because antimony decomposes at a low temperature. They were going to try hydrometallurgy, through vanners, sluice boxes, settling vats, and you can see there's not much information on this, but this is what apparently happened. They took 50% stibnite, which is a fairly rich ore. They did manage to concentrate it up to 86.5%, but they captured only 17% of it. In the settling vats and stuff, they captured about 33% of it. It wasn't really concentrated at all, and 50% of it was total waste. Went down the stream because stibnite, when it's milled, because it's so brittle, it crushes into very fine powdery crystals, just floated right. Well, maybe if this didn't work, a good smelter would have. Well, they constructed 3 furnaces. Now, it isn't clear what happened here. We know that by March 1887, the furnaces were up and operating. Then we get a report in June that the furnaces are under repair. No details. But we get a report in October that it was producing handsome bricks. And then we hear nothing. Nothing in 1887, nothing in 1888 and 89. And then suddenly in July 1890, the general manager says, we've just put up a new smelter in Philadelphia. And that's the last you hear of the Arkansas smelter. Now, it's not clear what happened. It may have been metallurgical problems, or it may have been they decided it was better to ship one thing, the ore, to Philadelphia, than to ship 3 things to the backwoods of Arkansas. Iron filings to reduce the stibnite, salt, and sodium carbonate as fluxus. In any case, second smelter in Arkansas goes out to, and with it, the Arkansas antimony mining district's second chance at impacting the market. On top of all that, the railroad number runs. They're guaranteed in 1887. One company posts a $50,000 bond, but as you can see, he's putting off, and by late 1887, U.S. Antimony Company saying, we can't do much until we get the railroad here. Then what's happening is it takes them a long time to get across the Red River, Texarkana. 12 miles into it. They've surveyed the rest. At this point, it's being promised by 1892. And it's too late. The attempt to get the whole district, most of the output of the district, and compact the antimony market, which it would have knocked out 2/3 to 3/4 of the import, dies. Basically, after 1890, U.S. demand for antimony keeps going up, and the Arkansas district doesn't produce unless the prices are abnormally high. They do get abnormally high, especially in World War I. You get a third attempt at building a smelter in Arkansas. Not clear what happened there either. It's the only picture of one, and no information on why it went out. But the price of antimony, which jumped from 12 to about 45 cents in the middle of 1916, and dropped down to about 12 again, might have something to do with it. But by the time World War I is over, it's over. The Chinese antimony fields have come into production, and they totally dwarf anything Arkansas had. Far easier to import Chinese antimony than to try to do the Arkansas fields. In fact, in World War II, when antimony is a critical material, there's a desperate attempt to get the government to take a look at the field. Bureau of Mines says, we don't think it's enough here to try to bother with. And as a result, the window of opportunity for Arkansas antimony to have any significant effect disappears. And essentially, now there's nothing left except some water-filled holes and a tailing pile or two where local road departments hadn't got hold of it. Now, I might say that as I was wrapping this up, I see something on the internet that Pantera Minerals is investigating the antimony deposits, rich antimony deposits, in southwest Arkansas, using modern geological techniques. Now, if any of you want to invest in Pantera Minerals, I just checked the price of their stock. If you steal the money back in the donation box there, you can probably buy 40,000, 50,000 shares. When I checked, Pantera Minerals selling at 1 cent, 1.5 cents a share. So, Arkansas antimony might make a comeback, but I don't think I'm going to put my money on it.
Okay, so our second presenter here is Dr. Mark Hendrickson, who's an associate professor and chair of the history department at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Hendrickson's research focuses on how American mining engineers and economic geologists working abroad since the 1880s helped shape the development of 20th century American capitalism, science, and foreign policy. His book, Never Alone, Antimony of U.S. Mineral History in the 20th and 21st Centuries, will appear in the History of Science series of Johns Hopkins University Press. The title of Dr. Hendrickson's talk today is Mining in U.S. History in the Age of Mineral Internationalism, 1970 to present.
All right, great to see you all. Terry had me worried with that title of your talk in the 1944. I thought maybe there was something I had missed about the increased antimony production. Yeah, but it turns out that's not. Yeah, I want to say as well that 3 years in a row of uninterrupted attention to antimony at MHA, pretty remarkable. The quotes that we have are one of the things. I gave this version of this talk at SME back in February. And as Dave mentioned, I became chair of my department, and I think I was doing pretty good at staying focused on my own work through last summer, into the fall. And then I had 2 dates in mind. There was SME in February, and then there was this conference. And I gave that talk at SME in February, and I thought, man, by the time I get to the Mining History Association, it's going to be a totally different talk. Well, that's not true. Progress stalled a little bit, and it's kind of timely to give it now, though, because one more week of classes left, and I'm going to be able to kind of return to this project. Where I left things off, I drafted the entire article, drafted the article, and was kind of working on the revisions and thinking about the significance. So to give this talk now, just as I'm heading back and heading into summer, is really great timing. The 3 quotes up, or the 3 columns of quotes rather, up on the screen. And I bridged the previous project, which was on antimony, to some of the current concerns that I have in terms of what I'm working on now. The antimony part, 1917, 1939, and Terry, this is kind of a nice bridge from what you were just talking about. 1917, China now assumed the lead in the world's production and practically controls the market. For those of you who are here at Hendrickson's talk about rare earths earlier this afternoon, Eric was talking about how China assumed a leadership role in the production of rare earths. And antimony is sort of the first part of that effort back in the World War I period. And then looking domestically in 1939, you have a blip in your chart, and in the 1940s when you're seeing an increase in antimony production in Arkansas, there's an effort to try to identify sources of antimony within the U.S. Mineral Yearbook says the development of a domestic antimony industry the most desirable method of overcoming our dependence on foreign sources of supply. Unfortunately, however, no resource in the United States offer little hope of achieving that result. So it's sort of abandoning the field in terms of antimony production for the Chinese by the time we get into the 1930s. So earlier than we see with some other minerals and elements. Then the current project is more reflective of what we see in the middle of the right, and that's the decline of the mining industry in the United States and thinking about its significance. So in 1984, Business Week had a cover story on the mining industry titled The Death of Mining. And included in that was an assessment of the significance of the death of mining from the chair of the Mineral Economics Department at Colorado School of Mines. And he said countries like Japan and West Germany have very, very strong economies and very low levels of metal self-sufficiency. So, what's to be worried about? And then fast forward, come back to this, the last quote a little bit later in the talk. But in terms of the durability of this, frankly, lack of concern, takes hold in the context of the 80s, one might argue, and then persists. And in May of 2025, in light of concerns about strategic and critical mineral reliance on China, in particular, Alan Beatty wrote in the Financial Times that it's not often that habitual complacency makes you an astute judge of world events, particularly those involving geopolitical conflict. But for decades, a shrug has been the best response to perennial panics over the shortages of critical raw materials. Complacency remains arguable, but it becomes ever weaker as time goes on. So in many respects, the current project is kind of answering a basic sort of question. Since the 1970s, the United States has sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly embraced the mineral internationalist, resource globalism, understanding this relationship to mineral supply chains. Probably I've seen the USGS chart over here on the right. Now, I'm asking sort of what brought this about. That part's kind of easy. But what's its significance? That sort of acceptance that we are reliant on other countries for the materials that go into industrial production in the United States and into our consumption. So to kind of sort that out, relying on a bunch of different sources, but one of my favorite ones are some of the oral histories that were done in Berkeley under a number of different titles, Western mining, global mining, but Eleanor Swank leads that effort. And I don't really see it very well, but these first four columns are all oral histories that were done by the Berkeley group. And this last column are more recent ones, all of which have been done by AIB. So all of them are available online, so easily accessible. That's kind of one of the raw materials that I'm drawing on in the case of this study. When I was here last year, I had this chance encounter with Doug Silver, who are exploration, I know Doug, so we've got one of them over here. The one that I want to focus on today is Simon Strauss. That's first. Anyone heard of Strauss before? How do you know Strauss, Roger?
I worked for Sarco.
Okay.
Every year, we drag him in, he'd predict a copper price, he'd be way off the next year. He never bothered to explain why, and I said, I want this guy.
All right, well, we should talk. When I was at SME, there was I asked that same question. We had a pretty good turnout for that group, and one thing that Strauss did later in his career is he taught at Colorado School of Mines, like at Columbia, a variety of different mining schools. He would teach a class periodically, and there were a couple of people at SME who said, yeah, he was my professor when I was doing some undergraduate training in mining and mineral economics in particular. So Strauss, Roscoe is the president there. When he retires in 1979, EMJ does this extensive interview with him, talk about his reflections on industry. He publishes this book in 1986, Trouble in the Third Kingdom. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these things as we move forward here. The interviews themselves by Swank are really pretty remarkable sources. This one with Strauss was 300 pages long, single space time that she sat down and she spent with Strauss. She's chiefly in 1994. And when in her introduction to this piece, this interview with Strauss, she says, Simon Strauss was one of the first recommended interviews for the Western Mining and 20th Century Oral History series. Although not a mining engineer, he had a pervading influence in the industry because of his writing, speaking, and analysis of the metals and metal market industry. He was the only non-technical member of the elite group who have been named Copperman of the Year. He also received a gold medal from the Mining Metallurgical Society of America. His career has spanned the universe of mineral industry, not only geographically, but intellectually. And in some ways, the sort of intellectual trajectory of his life and his work is something that I'm particularly interested in. And in some ways, he kind of becomes, let's say, in parts of his career, sort of a face of the mining industry in the same way that maybe John Hayes Hammond had been in the latter part of the 19th century, but Hoover was in the early part of the 20th century, into the 1920s. And then as we move into the World War II period, Charles Kenneth Lyle, University of Wisconsin, geology professor who assumed a real leadership role in some of the World War II organizations that I'll talk about. And in some respects, Lyle is 35 years younger than Strauss, and kind of works in that same sort of trajectory, sort of intellectual sort of concern about looking at the mining industry, and in some ways being public face of that industry. His background is pretty interesting. His father assumes a role that I think many of us are familiar with in terms of mining engineering and the global impact of mining engineers in the late 19th and early 20th century. EMJ said in 1896, every year brings a wider recognition of the fact that mining and practical metallurgy, American engineers are the most successful and economical in the world, and their services are requested in nearly every country in the world. And Simon was born in Peru, and then spent some of Chile, while his father was working particularly on copper mines and then some of the nitrates. Father is interesting in his own right. He graduates from the Columbia School of Mines. During World War II, he shifts from his work in Peru to Chile. He works extensively with William Braden on El Teniente, the early exploration of El Teniente in Chile, which remains like the biggest copper mine in the world, and works on some of the early open pit mines in Chile as well. And in terms of what he did, Simon, kind of recalling his father's work, reflects some of that same stuff that EMJ talked about. Is that, and this is what my father did. At one time, this is from the oral history, at one time or another, I think he examined mineral deposits on behalf of every major mining organization in the United States, Great Britain, and European countries. They would employ him by cable communication. He would prepare a preliminary report that was favorable. Then the companies might send out their own engineer to confirm the results of his examination. But he operated on this basis in 1904, 1906 perhaps, until after he finished his engagement until 1927, when he would finally return to the United States. So he had a long career. He was very well known and worked with many really large companies and examined the major deposits in South America. So kind of an interesting fits. His father fits really into that global expansion of American mining expertise that was sort of built about, as Kevin Wright talks about in his work, human capital investment in economic geology, mining engineers, and how that helped to propel the development, not only of American mining, but globally as well. This is that part of the story. And when Strauss is born in 1911, think about U.S. mineral production in 1913. Gavin Wright has written, the United States was the world's dominant producer of every major industrial mineral in that era. So it comes of age at a time when American mining is producing most of the stuff that's needed in American manufacturing. So from there all the way to the U.S. At a very young age, he is he's interested not really in mining. His father was in mining. It's not what he wants to do. He's interested in writing. He wants to be a writer, maybe a newspaper editor or something like that. We've got a family friend, Arthur Allen, who recently been hired by EMJ as an engineering mining journal as its editor. And he knows Simon. He's interested in writing. 16 years old. He said, well, you go to school, you don't work for me. And at a fairly young age, born in 1911, he starts to work for EMJ. At the same time, he starts to take classes at New School in New York City. This would put him in touch with some pretty interesting people. You know, Wesley Mitchell, Thorstein Veblen, and Charles Beard teaching at New School at this time, and John Dewey. He didn't recall Mitchell. He didn't, in the oral history doesn't mention Mitchell. It doesn't mention Veblen. But it does talk about the influence of John Dewey on his life. And you can see kind of in his writing in particular, that sort of broader vision of what the industry place in American life, what that looked like. And he said about the classes themselves in the school, is that the classes were not at all concerned with mining metals, but broad discussions of political and economic trends. So in 1930, he's writing for EMJ, pretty young, 19 years old. And he's sort of setting an intellectual agenda for himself, at least on some level, a kind of an interesting moment. It's really in World War I where Americans realize that we're dependent on other countries for certain things, like tin and nitrates, and things that we don't produce domestically. And he writes in one of his EMJ articles, says, is a situation concerning gold of sufficient importance toward action leading towards domestic gold production, or should the United States depend on other nations to produce increasing quantities of gold? Kind of an interesting question for a 19-year-old to be asking. Should we? Is this a problem? Right? So the same question I'm kind of starting with for my own work. Is it a problem, and in what way is it a problem? It's something he's thinking about from his teenage years. As I mentioned, he wants to be a writer more than he does in the mining. He wants to work in the mining industry. But in 1932, he leaves EMJ and goes to work for a new editor of a small New Jersey newspaper. Returns to the mining industry in 1935. Between 35 and 41, works as an analyst for Standard as for the editor of SMP, looking specifically now at the mining industry. At this point, he's in the mining pretty much for the rest of his life. He worked during World War II. He worked with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is really an interesting body within the federal government in this period that is focused on doing a whole bunch of things, all the way from working on minerals to serving as the lender of last resort when the Federal Reserve doesn't do its job. With the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, he worked on a number of different things within the Metal Reserve Company. That's a company that's established within this governing body, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And he looks at things like manganese, tin, chrome, aluminum, graphite, mica, and describing this, he said this was an unparalleled education in terms of what he was exposed to while working for the RFC. But every one of these has got really interesting stories behind it. What's great about the RFC and why I like Strauss is, I like to study Strauss, is that he's a public person. So he's testifying before Congress, right? He's working for government bodies. He's working for corporations. He's quoted by newspapers. So you can take his oral sources and you can kind of corroborate them with what we're seeing in some other sources as well. And if anyone's worked with Reconstruction Finance Corporation records at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, but they're some of the best organized files that I've ever worked with before. I used to run some of the Antimony stuff in World War II. So run across the RFC and do research at College Park. Those are good ones to look at. The example of just one quick example. Tin is a really interesting one, and the company that he's working for is the government company, the Federal Reserve Corporation. But when they're looking at tin, pre-war production of tin, the United States is producing tin. It's coming from Bolivia, Southeast Asia, for all the wars, and Africa, and African war. And it's being transported to British refiners, and they have to take a mix of it. Bolivian ore is there's a lot of problems with the Bolivian ore, and they're really only able to process it effectively into metallic ore. They're able to combine it with tin ore from other places. Okay, so that works before the war. The United States isn't producing much in the way of tin. You got mining, of course, but ore and refining. But war happens, and it disrupts supply chains for antimony, of course, but for other things, like tin. So Bolivia had been sending its ore to British processors. That's cut off. The United States doesn't really have any, kind of getting to Terry's point, you have to have expertise in terms of refining this ore. We don't have any of that either. Right? And now we're reliant on Bolivian ore, which there's a problem with the Bolivian ore in terms of processing in the United States. So we've got some ore that's coming in, but we don't know how to process it. So that's sort of the puzzle that Strauss sort of works on in this context, was finding the expertise, the people who were able to process it, and then building the facilities in Texas City, Texas in this case, where you're able to bring in some Bolivian ore, find some other stuff from Malaysia, combine it into something that you're able to process, to turn into metallic tin that you can use in industry. And in all these other instances, there's similar sorts of stories like that of reliable supply chains being cut off in the context of the war, and people trying to figure out what are we going to do about this. And the government playing a leadership role in that context in trying to organize these industries. By the end, he says about working with Reconstruction Finance Corporation, I met everybody. Like everybody's working on this stuff. So just a pretty amazing networking opportunity. Coming out of the war, we had more time to get into more detail here, but coming out of World War II, there's a lot of concern, right? With scarcity sorts of problems, that we're gonna run out of this stuff. Haley Commission talks about how the United States is consuming all these materials, all these minerals, all these elements, and the supply is not going to be able to keep up. And that concern persists through the 1970s, public realm, where the limits of So anyway, we're coming out of this, coming out of World War II, real concerns about scarcity. By the time we get to 1979, editor Leech retiring, I met Unesco, the editor of Stan, the editor of MHA, refers to Strauss as the resident philosopher of the mining industry. And he publishes this Trouble in the Third Kingdom. And in chapter 8 of this book, kind of looks at, okay, what happened here, right? We had this increased production during World War II. We had concerns about scarcity coming out of World War II that persisted into the 60s and the 70s. What did they get wrong in terms of their assumptions? There's a bunch of things that he talks about that things got wrong, but one of the big ones was the lack of exploration. In the context of the 1930s and the Great Depression, plummeting demand for minerals, and Strauss says, there wasn't any exploration in that period. Once we got out of the 1940s, we saw lots of exploration resuming, and as a result of that, combine that with the growing economy, the golden age of capitalism between the 1940s and the early 1970s, and you've got a recipe for increased production. And that's sort of what they missed with the mission and felt for growth. Then he turns his attention, okay, we are becoming more and more reliant on other countries for our mineral supplies. And that's okay. It's 1986. Is that a problem? So, what's the nature of that problem? I'm going to come back to the central planning economies here just a little bit. Their efforts at mineral self-sufficiency. But he looks at market economies like the United States, and looking at that dependence, he says, there's actually a lot of things that could be done. Market economies can, try to stimulate demand production if they've run into concerns about scarcity of production and reliance on other countries. You can encourage recycling. Even there, he's got some concerns. He's looking at the lead industry in particular. About the lead industry in the context of the 1980s, increased regulation, and a lot of recyclers were being pushed out of business in this period. Conservation, it's a good idea. Substitution, looking for substitute products. If you're reliant on one country for a particular good, that's fine. Stockpiling, deeply skeptical about stockpiling. A bit of a surprise. Because at one point, whether or not a stockpile program has been valued by the U.S. government over the years, it has had a stabilizing consequence for the mineral industry. They didn't have a lot of confidence in policymakers. They're able to develop a stockpile, and so you're able to get that stockpile. Well, you got to question about what you're going to do with it. So if the price of something, cobalt, for example, that's using over in that picture on the right, were to go up, and the government decides that it wants to artificially keep the price of cobalt down, that's going to decrease exploration for cobalt, and you're going to just run into a whole bunch of problems. So stockpiling might be good for some sort of purposes, but actually in terms of the way that it's administered, it's pretty problematic. And then when he's looking at planned economies in this period, he draws on Russia and China in particular. He says, what's motivating these countries? National security, conserving foreign exchange. He looks at the two models here of the Soviet Union, which had developed a lot of mineral supplies and was, in some respects, more mineral independent than the United States, the market economies like that. But he says, if you decide to do that, that's not free. There are considerable costs to be borne by conflict. I look at the Soviet Union in particular. It says, in the past 40 years, the Soviet Union has achieved a massive increase in mineral production and consumption. This has been attained at a cost. Some of this mineral output would not have been viable in a competitive market. Thus, living standards have improved at a slower rather than market economies countries. In many quarters, including statements made by the country's leaders, the Soviet economic position is viewed as unsatisfactory. So we devote a lot of resources to trying to be mineral independent, choosing to use those resources for one thing and not for another thing. There's opportunity costs brought on by that in this period. Now, when he's thinking about this, just to wrap things up here, there is sort of kind of a crucial context to keep in mind. If we're looking at the degree of U.S. mineral dependence in 1951, the way the chart is organized is kind of interesting. It stresses domestic production, right? All the things on that the United States is able to produce in sufficient we go to 1985, publishing that book in 1986, so we look at the state of U.S. Consumption of minerals and dependence, the situation is reversed, right? Now they're stressing the amount of dependence that the United States has on other countries. And what's interesting is over here, think about U.S. dependence in 1985, it says, that's a big deal. You can look at who we're dependent on for these sorts of things. Canada is a big one, Republic of South Africa, Brazil, Spain, many of these nations, well, maybe Canada's not a friendly nation anymore, but it used to be. But many of these nations are sort of nations that we see over here, sort of from the more in the Western Hemisphere, countries that might be more sympathetic and be in that sort of larger nexus of the market economy. We compare that to today, 2025, we had import reliance. We're reliant on a very different set of countries. So, as I'm just starting this new project, thinking about this idea, the United States, the history of the United States dependence on other countries for minerals, what brought that change about, and then what is its significance? Say between the 1980s and today, dependence has increased, but I think the significance has changed quite a bit as well. And I'll just close with this. When I was at SME, everybody who I could find were talking to me and asked them, we're thinking about the mineral industry in the United States right now. Is this time different, right? Are we heading in a different direction in terms of that dependent story than we were in the past? And I'd say overwhelmingly, the answer was skeptical about whether or not this is actually a different time. So, more to come on this. Thank you.
Okay, well, we can just get going here. So our final presenter here today is Dr. Ryan Leech, who is an associate professor and chair of the history department at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. His book, The City That Ate Itself, Butte, Montana, and its Expanding Berkeley, won the MHA's Clark C. Spence Award for the best book in mining history. And he is currently completing a book on mining and American pop culture. The title of Dr. Leech's talk today is The Social Disease of Gold Fever in the Mining Movie Western. Welcome, Brett.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. Let me begin with a quick tale here about one of these movies I'm going to talk about. And that is The Naked Hills, which is a Western movie from 1956. It provides a rather bleak story about gold prospecting. In this movie, the California gold rush has just begun, and joining that rush from Missouri are Tracy Powell and Bert Killian. Tracy, who's played by actor David Wayne, seems determined not to be just like everyone else, working hard for a little payoff. He seems convinced he'll make a big gold find. To do so, he goes along with a plan by the rough Sam Wilkins, who practices claim jumping, stealing a claim from two other miners. Powell comes to believe that Wilkins may be right, that he can't have a weak stomach and get rich. When Wilkins refuses to split the gold up evenly, Tracy threatens him with a gun and gathers up his share. Despite this trouble, Tracy refuses his old friend Bert's suggestion to get out of mining. Tracy tells him that he'd rather look for gold so that he can live like a king the rest of his days. Bert tells his friend, quote, "You got a sickness, Tracy. You'll either die from it or you'll end up partners with the devil. There ain't no in between." After years in the hills, Tracy finally returns. Finding that Willie Haver, his arch nemesis, controls his ability to get a stake in a new mine, he decides to give up on his search for gold, and he returns to his love, Julie. He tries to settle down with Julie and starts farming. His friend Jim O'McCann, though, persuades Tracy to head back out to search for more gold. He misses the birth of his son, and he witnesses Jimmo's death in a cave-in just after they have located a streak of gold. Despite this tragedy, Tracy returns to town triumphant, excited to have finally struck it rich. He meets his son, and seems ready to settle down yet again, but it turns out that his mine isn't as rich as he thought it would be, so he dashes back out to the hills. Despite the protestations from Bert and Julie, he stays out in the hills. He suffers alone in his continued search. When he finally comes back into town years and years later, his son, now a grown man, invites him back home, where Tracy, rather amazingly, is welcomed by his wife Julie, and I mean rather amazingly, shouldn't say. There are two key villains in the Naked Hills. One's the greedy, corrupt Willis Haver. He initially employs men like Sam Wilkins to claim junk, and later Haver comes to quietly control the syndicate of capitalists who bankroll mineral production across the region. The movie takes pains to tell viewers that Willie Haver is a different kind of man than Tracy. Tracy has good at his core, but his addiction to gold affects all of his decisions. Haver, on the other hand, seems thoroughly taken in by greed for gold, willing to do almost anything to increase his wealth. But the real villain in Naked Hills is Tracy himself. The movie tries to explain the lead character's inexplicable behavior through Tracy's gold fever. This fever has blinded Tracy Powell to the fact that his life would be better if he simply settled down. Powell has gambled away years of his modest comfort by tramping around the mountains in hopes of a single big payday. In the meantime, the community he should have joined has developed from a rough, boisterous mining camp into a grand city. His friend Bert has become a successful businessman. Viewers get the sense that Tracy could have followed in Bert's footsteps if it weren't for his addiction to gold. Although aficionados might balk at my decision here to start this presentation about Westerns with a movie starring David Wayne and not John Wayne, Naked Hills, I think, provides a window into the genre's approach to mining. Mining could mean excitement and adventure, but it could also lead characters into dark places, both figuratively and literally. Characters like Tracy could get infected with gold fever, leading them astray, while others, like Willis Haver, could get so invested in their own greed that they become something worse, a corporate executive. In many movie westerns, gold and silver tend to corrupt. Broken landscapes, communities, and people result. So in comparison to ranchers and cowboys, miners are of course not the most popular choice for westerns, but mining still reappears with some relative frequency, at least through the genre's heyday. Over the last few decades, scholars have begun to look closely at mining westerns, with most of them suggesting that Hollywood's version of the mining west is rather gloomy. Robin Murray and Joseph Heumann contend that many mining westerns showcase land exploitation and evil corporations, while William Gravener argues that mining westerns set in the desert, quote, probe the dark side of the American experience by focusing on characters who lust for gold, sex, or power. My analysis follows their work, noting that even in the westerns Gravener celebrates as focused on building community, the mining places themselves remain rather repugnant, while the mining people are susceptible to the ills of gold fever. As it developed in the movie Western, gold fever soon became a way to critique men's risk-taking behaviors and their materialist mindsets. So where did this idea of gold fever come from? So I searched through a lot of databases, and it suggests that gold fever itself crystallized during the California gold rush in the 1840s and 50s. At least 300,000 people arrived in California during that initial rush, and to describe this unprecedented event, the term gold fever reached an initial spike in publications during the event's heyday. Many used gold fever to explain how quickly excitement about a mineral find could spread. Because fever indicated the possibility of contagion, right? People enjoyed this metaphor because it would say, well, people joined this westward push. And a good example would be J.M. Gunn in 1849, who described gold rushes as, quote, epidemic. They break out in unlikely places when least expected, become contagious, and then disappear. Others use the metaphor to express concerns about the people who joined each rush. In 1851, essayist Henry Tuckerman described the symptoms of gold fever as including delirium. This sickness injected hopeful imagination to a regular person, transforming them into a gold adventurer. Unlike other resources, gold was not utilitarian. Instead, people desired gold for improper reasons, as a symbol of power. Tuckerman was forgiving of poor people, those driven by absolute necessity to California. But he wondered about the large class whose real wants had ample provision, who engaged in this enterprise for a most extravagant, untenable idea of the value of nominal wealth and the mere symbols of fortune. For observers like Tuckerman, men joining the rush to California were foolhardy, middle-class citizens unready for the hardships that awaited. Only something unusual and insidious, a social and mental sickness, could induce these regular people to take on such unnecessary risks. Still other Americans alighted on the metaphor because it helped to describe just how much the rush affected places the gold seekers had left behind. Like a disease epidemic, gold fever could hit a community and quickly rob it of industrious men. Mary Ward's memoir, Female Life Among the Mormons, for instance, explained that when gold fever broke out, it raged with unparalleled violence, she writes. But whereas, quote, epidemics are mostly local or confined to specific localities, gold fever extended into all the cities, end quote. In Utah, the news of gold in California ran through the country like wildfire. Many people, quote, forsook their farms and mechanic shops, while manufacturers came to an immediate standstill from a dearth of hands, as folks ran off to the diggings. Men abandoned families, and children were commanded to be good while Papa went to get gold. According to Ward, Mormon leader Brigham Young inveighed bitterly against the love of gold and commanded everyone to stay, but many men refused to listen and instead headed to California. A few years into the rush, the themes seemed set in stone. London's satirical Punch pocketbook from 1852 could therefore offer the following critique of America's gold fever. Accompanied by a violent thirst for gold, this fever left brains entirely destitute of rational guidance. Soon the sufferer has forgotten his own relationship so thoroughly, they write, that he has run away from his wife and family to proceed to the spot where he fancies his thirst for gold may be satisfied. Gold fever was accompanied by extreme chilliness that invaded around her heart, making the sufferer wrapped up in themselves. Punch ended with a warning for the condition's effects on society as a whole. Quote, gold fever is exceedingly contagious and spreads with almost rapidity, deranging the economy of all whom it reaches, leading to excess of extravagance and hurting the moral as well as physical health of families and their society. During the rush to the Yukon in the 1890s and the Alaska rush a few years later, gold fever experienced its highest spike in print usage. Gold seekers became seen as either hardy pioneers or foolhardy gamblers. The concept of gold fever came to signify this later detrimental view. The more triumphalist view dominated early media about mining in the West, especially after the rushes ended and frontier nostalgia infused the Western genre. Prospectors who went out to locate precious metals became the key characters to showcase this more positive view of mining once Westerns moved to film. Early silent films largely favored prospectors as hardworking, upstanding heroes. Bronco Billy and the Claim Jumpers from 1915 stars Bronco Billy Anderson as a prospector. Early in the movie, Billy successfully locates gold on his claim, but Claim Jumpers try to poison his significant other's father and then steal his claim. Billy holds off the villain so he can register his new find before the would-be thieves arrive. Billy's hard work makes him worthy of his claim, whereas the villains try to use slippery treachery to get riches of their own. Early sound films tried in an even more celebratory vein. Mining movies during the Great Depression and World War II often made prospectors into heroes, suggesting that while it may prove difficult, the search for gold was justifiable. Prospectors in The Lucky Texan from 1934, played by Western standbys John Wayne and Gadget Thomas, easily find precious metals. This pair of prospectors' heroes then fight against evil corporate forces trying to control the nearby town. Villains themselves were therefore not prospectors in these films, they were greedy thieves. By the middle of the 20th century, movies had already shifted towards more ambivalence, if not outright criticism of its prospectors. After World War II, mining westerns followed other westerns becoming more morally complex. As historian John Lenahan put it, although escapism, complacency, and a celebration of materialism are often assumed to dominate the immediate post-war era, westerns usually critique this new America. Like intellectuals of the era, westerns similarly revealed a preoccupation with anxiety, alienation, disillusionment, and the search for individual dignity and meaning in a confused and hostile world. Westerns use gold fever to interrogate the pursuit of wealth in particular that becomes so important to the affluent post-war era. Gold fever could infect otherwise upstanding, honest men, leading them into jealousy, greed, and violence. Most famously, gold fever affected the heroes of the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. In this 1948 movie, two American drifters, Fred Dobbs and Bob Curtin, meet an old prospector, Howard, in a small Mexican town. The three men decide to prospect together. Early in the film, the old prospector warns his younger companions about the dangers of prospecting, stating that, quote, "I know what gold does to men's souls. As long as there's no find, the noble brotherhood will last. But when the piles of gold begin to grow, that's when the trouble starts." The three wind their way into the remote Sierra Madre Mountains. A spry and energetic Howard soon identifies gold. They build a small operation to gather gold dust, but outlaws find them. They run the outlaws off and then leave to take their gold back to town. When Howard leaves the group to help a sick child in a village nearby, though, an increasingly paranoid Dobbs kills Curtin, or tries to kill Curtin, whom he fears he will steal all the gold. Curtin survives, but Dobbs is undone by his greed. The aforementioned bandits find him, kill him, steal his burro, and discard the gold dust into the wind, mistaking it for sand. Sorry for the spoiler in that 1948 movie. The Treasure of the Sierra Madre gives viewers two approaches to prospectors, right? It showcases the good prospector in Howard, a grizzled but hard-working, joyful individual. The movie also celebrates his reverence towards nature and its mineral gifts. At one point, Howard tells the incredulous Dobbs and Curtin that they need to take another week to break down the mine to put the mountain back in shape. He insists the miners need to make her appear like she was before we came. We wounded this mountain. It's our duty to close those wounds. Howard is similarly kind towards other people. Yet the movie also provides a rather horrific image of the prospectors with Fred Dobbs. His worst traits, like jealousy and paranoia, come out in full force once he catches gold fever. Indeed, the prospecting enterprise generated many deadly sins in late 1940s and 1950s westerns. In Lust for Gold from 1949, two men, Waltz and Weiser, trailed two other men in 1880s Arizona, only to shoot them once they know the location of their mine. Waltz then turns on his friend. Once he returns to Phoenix with information about his new mine, Waltz is wooed by Julia Thomas, who hides both her marriage to a man named Pete and her devious plan to gain access to Waltz's mine. After traveling to Waltz's mine, Pete and Julia are surprised by Waltz. Julia stabs Pete, declares her love for Waltz. Yet further tragedy strikes. Of course, a rockfall kills her and then closes the mine also at the same time. As the title indicates, right, greed undoes everyone in the movie. It's a movie without heroes because gold fever has infected them all. For another example, oh, this is Lust for Gold. My goodness, I'm behind this one. For another example, take a 1954 movie, Bait, which combines Western and noir tropes. It hits viewers over the head with its morality tale, starting the film with a prologue from the devil himself. The devil tells viewers it does not take much time for him to cause trouble. He simply whispers suggestions to people who are easily persuaded. We then meet Marco, a middle-aged man who is searching for a lost gold mine. A younger man, Ray, has agreed to help Marco for a 50-50 share of whatever they find. After they locate the mine, Marco listens to the devil's whispers. He decides he won't share his new wealth, so he elaborately plots Ray's murder. I'll show the screen down below there. It's Bait. He marries a woman that Ray fancies, and Marco tries to push Ray together with her in hopes that he can kill Ray for the sin of adultery, as it apparently is acceptable to do so in this community as an unwritten law. Although Ray had been at first smitten with the gold, after Marco's new wife Peggy joins them in the miners' cabins, Ray starts to dream of her and not of the gold. Marco, however, cannot be rescued by human companionship. He's been driven mad by his lust for gold. At the end of the movie, Ray stops Marco from murdering him, and both he and Peggy leave. Meanwhile, Marco breaks his leg. Unable to walk, he crawls out of the cabin as a blizzard sets in, headed towards a lonely death as he's frozen with his hand still grasping around a bag of gold. Gold fever is again undone the prospector. Like the same era as The Naked Hills, Bates' portrayal of gold fever thus serves as a vehicle to critique post-World War II conformist materialism. Mirrors concerns held by 1950s intellectuals like Vance Hacker, who worried about Americans' obsessions with status, power, and wealth. In some ways, men like Marco, Ray, and Tracy are also 1950s rebels, like Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye or Jim Stark from Rebel Without a Cause. They don't want to be stuck in a boring job in a complacent conformist home life. By the end of the decade, Westerns were, however, on their way out of box office primacy. The few that featured prospectors wavered between positive and negative portrayals. Like other 1950s prospectors, Carl Malden's prospecting character in 1959's The Hanging Tree is also undone by greed and lust. He attempts to sexually assault a woman with whom he has struck it rich, a despicable act that leads to his death by gunshot. Most of the other prospectors in the film, however, seem to be upstanding people, even if they were driven into a tizzy when gold fever breaks out. Other mining figures beyond the prospector became prominent during the middle of the 20th century, too. Although movie westerns typically focused on early days of the rush, by the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, several recognized how quickly mining had become a big industrial business. Mining owners and executives became key figures in these westerns. Because they were already prone to being power-hungry, mine executives seemed to be more incontrovertibly affected by gold fever than independent prospectors and miners. In some ways, their portrayal mirrors American culture's broader, long-standing, and very negative approach towards executives. Silver Dollar from 1932, for instance, roughly follows the real-life story of Colorado silver magnate Horace Tabor, renaming him Gates Martin for some reason. Although the movie expresses sympathy towards its main character, Martin suffers from several character flaws, including excessive pride. Gradually, his charming, fun-loving approach to life gets overridden by his even bigger ego, which grows alongside his silver-derived wealth. He dubs his wife for a young woman who flatters him, he pursues a high political office, and he pays excessively so that he can win admirers. He spares no expense to construct a grand opera house. The movie plays out as a tragedy. Martin's romantic affair ends his political career, and the falling price of silver throws him into poverty. All that's left is the opera house, on whose stage Martin collapses at the end of the movie. Silver River from 1948 looks much like Silver Dollar, even if its main character strays even farther into immorality and hence into the territory of something like Citizen Kane. The main character in Silver River is a mining baron who fits the model established by Silver Dollar, sympathetic but also suffering from pride and greed. The movie follows the character of Mike McComb, played by Errol Flynn, as he builds a silver mining empire in Nevada. He too exhibits many biblical sins, greed, pride, and lust. Not satisfied with owning one business, McComb soon dominates the economic life of Silver City. To show off his success, he builds a massive mansion with materials flown in from around the world. He even covets his neighbor's wife, sending her engineer husband to his death. He ends up with the engineer's wife until she learns of McComb's dirty deed. McComb also pursues an economic war when another group attempts to corner the silver market. His aggressive response pushes his own miners out of work. When confronted with the way that his pride has hurt other people, he initially proclaims, quote, "I made Silver City and I can break it," end quote. McComb's lawyer later rejects him and heads into populist politics. It's only after the tragic death of this lawyer-turned-politician that McComb decides to change. He instead devotes his attention to improving the lives of the people in Silver City. His wife approves and rejoins him. McComb shows that not all mining executives were irredeemable. His silver fever could abate, and he could see the decency in favoring human relationships over silver and the material goods it brought him, but only after a tragedy. McComb wasn't the worst boss in mid-20th century westerns. Boss Kruger, the mine owner in 1950s Barricade, runs a mine that functions as a prison. The miners are criminals and fugitives. He rules over them with an iron fist. He belittles and bullies everyone in his charge. When another character challenges his emotional and physical abuse, Kruger explains, "My strength is my justification. When I want a thing, I take it." Viewers later learn that Kruger killed his own brother so that he could gain control of the mine and its riches. A monstrous man who survives a mine blast designed to kill him, digging his way out by hand, just kind of like a comic book supervillain. It's only when the entire mine collapses on top of Kruger that he finally meets his end. Despite mining movies decreasing in frequency, the 1970s similarly featured villainous executives. This trend matched the counterculture's anti-authority approach, but it also continued the pre-existing bad reputation for mine executives. In Robert Altman's anti-Western, McCabe and Mrs. Miller from 1971, the character of John McCabe grows successful in the small town of Bear Paw at the turn of the 20th century. His wealth comes from running a brothel and a gambling hall. McCabe thinks highly of his business instincts, and so he doesn't realize how poorly he handles a visit from two agents sent by the Harrison Shawhazy Mining Company. The agents hope to buy McCabe's businesses and the nearby zinc mines. McCabe tries to extract a higher price, and the agents balk and leave. The company is clearly a vicious, corrupt mining enterprise that's used to getting its way, though. Its leaders therefore send hired guns to kill McCabe. The 1980s featured even more portrayals of ruthless, manipulative, immoral executives in high finance and big business, think movies like Wall Street or Trading Places. The mining western had its own version. The main villain in Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider from 1985 is Coy LaHood, a mining magnate who's trying to scare independent miners and their families off their land. The movie contrasts the idyllic, independent miners and their families who seem at one with nature as they gently gather gold from the stream, with the evil mining corporation, which practices destructive hydraulic mining, streaming massive blasts of water to the hillsides. Other prospectors return in the 1980s too. In the 1982 TV movie Motherlode, Charlton Heston, of all people, plays unhinged prospector Silas McGee. His paranoia and greed lead him to attack the young prospectors who encounter him in the backcountry. His suspicion is well placed in that one young man, Jean Dupree, catches gold fever and gets obsessed with the gold that may be in McGee's mine. A near-death experience helps to snap Gene out of his foolish fever, though, as he recognizes that the woman he has traveled to the area with is more important to him than wealth. He leaves without gold, tossing the one chunk he recovered to a man he meets on the river. Eureka from 1983 is even bleaker. It uses the early prospecting success of Jack McCann, played by Gene Hackman, to showcase the ways that gold fever can mean a curse. A clairvoyant named Frida predicts that Jack will find gold, but that gold will mean a grim fate for both him and those around him. Jack finds gold the next day, which makes him wildly wealthy, but he immediately finds Frida dead. Years later, the greed and debauchery surrounding Jack leads to his own brutal murder. Westerns, of course, receded during later decades. Of those later movies, I want to point to the 2018 film The Sisters Brothers, which deserves mention for its dark portrayal of greed as integral to Western gold rushes. Set during the early days of the California gold rush, The Sisters Brothers follows two outlaw brothers who are among a bevy of characters trying to track down Herman Kermit Warren. Warren has created a chemical formula that, when added to water, will cause gold to glow. The brothers team up with Worm, but the impulsivity and gold fever of one of the brothers, Charlie, leads to the death of both Worm and Worm's companion, John Morris. Charlie adds too much of the caustic chemical to his stream despite Worm's warnings. Worm wanted to use any wealth he gained to create a utopian community, while Morris is seeking a new purpose in life after rebelling against his wealthy father. Their grim deaths from chemical exposure are portrayed as truly tragic results of Charlie's impulsive gold fever. Charlie also loses his own arm to the chemical. This prospecting tragedy frightens Charlie into retirement from his violent career as a gun for hire. Hence, The Sisters Brothers concentrates on the ways that the search for wealth can generate jealousy and retribution, even while it suggests that many gold prospectors simply sought better lives out west. So what should we therefore make of gold fever as a trope? Likely because prospecting represented an exciting stage of mining, it should not surprise us that the prospector makes so many appearances in the Western. The prospector points back to a 19th century frontier that most Westerns celebrated. As a character, the prospector therefore makes the most changes, from a generally positive view during the early 20th century to more negative appearances in the 1940s and 50s, and then in between, flip-flopping into ambivalence starting in the 60s. The mining Western appreciated adventurous prospectors willing to humbly put in hard work, whereas the villains in frontier-themed films tried to forego that work in favor of a quick payday. Still, gold fever could unsettle, if not infect, many prospectors and Westerns. Some men seemed impervious to this disease, though, particularly if they've already built up immunity through thoughtful, healthy relationships with nature, other humans, or their own psyche. Dobbs in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre seems liable to catch gold fever because he struggles with women and its seeing value in the landscape, while Howard from the same movie appears more at home in both nature and with other people. Tracy Powell in The Naked Hills cannot form lasting relationships and desires a life beyond normality, hence he's likely to catch the disease. The same goes for Charlie's sister in The Sisters Brothers, suffered from an abusive father as a child which made him violent and impulsive. Hence gold fever strikes him, whereas his brother, Eli, and two companions in the mining operation seem more able to form good relationships with others. Loners like Charlton Heston's prospector in Motherlode have been driven into gold fever through their isolation, whereas the character of Jean Dupree from the same movie can be resuscitated because he realizes he cares more for companionship than gold. Perhaps because they're believed to be better at building such relationships, women typically seem immune to gold fever. Congratulations. For men who caught gold fever, though, it was tough, but still possible to recover from it. Suggesting that few prospectors were inherently evil, they simply needed the right disposition and assistance to fight off the devil's disease, as Mike McComb eventually did in Silver River. Gold fever came to represent a materialist view of the world that people could learn to reject, but only once they recognized the value of healthy relationships and a stable society, as Tracy Powell finally does at the end of The Naked Hills. It's unfortunately true, however, that excessive greed and pride could turn men inside out if they became truly successful. The mining executive, having reached a pinnacle of power and wealth, thus represented a difficulty many would face after being completely overtaken by gold fever. So while the development of this trope in mining Western showcases popular culture's primarily negative approach to the mining industry, the trope itself becomes rather nuanced over time, suggesting maybe a little bit more flexibility in Hollywood's approach to mining than has been previously shown. Westerns themselves tend to be less likely to consider gold fever today, but the concept still appears in media all the time. You can take this recent article in The New Yorker, which is highly critical of recent rushes as greedy and foolish, suggesting that these themes will continue to live on. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you to all our presenters. So we have a few minutes for questions. I think we have until 5, so we have 5 or so minutes. So I don't know if there's any questions in here yet.
I have a question for Brian. All these examples you did to the mining was like a main character in them. Have you at all looked at Westerns where there are secondary character prospectors? Like, the first one that just popped to mind for me was the prospector in the parody Blazing Saddles, where he's shown as a little bit off, but people still like respect him in town, kind of. Have you looked at all of how in these actually series films, the side characters of prospectors are considered?
That's a great example. Yeah, I mean, I would guess that prospector character, again, is especially, I mean, I think it's especially playing on the Walter Houston character, right? That he plays Howard in that. And it's the Treasure of the Sierra Madre because it was such a impactful and won him an Oscar and all sorts of stuff. So the short answer is I spent a little bit of time, you're right, as side characters, they're either goofy, or they just kind of wander on and off, right? They're to kind of give you some sort of sense that a new event's about to happen. I guess what I would say is I decided not to spend much time with them since I was trying to make a new genre called the mining western, which I decided is a thing. And mostly because I was trying to find movie examples that definitely have mining more at the center of the story. You're right, that they, of course, appear a lot, right? They're wandering through mining towns all the time, or just towns, western towns. So even in cowboy westerns, right, you'll see a prospector wander by and through, and they have pans and stuff all over them. Whatever, I'd say that's especially what they show today. Oh yeah, definitely. I've got lots of thoughts on that.
All right, any more questions? We have time for another one for sure. Everybody's ready for a break, I think. That's okay. All right, well, join me one last time in thanking our speakers.